really pleased to be able to launch today with this conversation. Jasper and I, as Margareta referenced, have sat around the table over the years on this whole issue of humans, creatures, the landscape, the environment, and how do you work together to solve problems. And I learned so much from the scientists and advisors who are around that table. It's been 9 years since I stepped off the board, and I've watched them grow. I'd like to hear you tell your story. What is the Nature Trust? Where did it come from? What does it do? And what thoughts do you have for this group, Jasper?
Thanks, Stuart. Great to reconnect. The Nature Trust of BC was launched back in 1971, so back in the day when the landscape of BC was very different, both from an economic and an environmental perspective. And it was launched by the federal government of the day to celebrate BC's centennial in Canada. And the idea was to take funds and invest them in protecting some of the most important, ecologically important areas of the province. Since that time, through partnerships guided by experts like Stuart on our board, we've had a long tradition of having some of the best and brightest from industry, from academia, from various sectors of BC's economy on our board. And we've protected over 180,000 acres of land across the province, many of them right here on Vancouver Island. We're going to talk about some of the work that we've done here on the island today, both in protecting and restoring land in partnership with all levels of government, with First Nations, with corporations, and British Columbians who want to invest and their hard-earned dollars in protecting the amazing natural assets of BC that Richard mentioned and that are all over this great province.
Now, might as well get a plug-in. Do you have any events coming up that anyone can attend?
Thanks, Stuart. As a matter of fact, next week, our flagship fundraiser is in Vancouver at the Fairmont Hotel Vancouver. There's a couple sponsor tables left, and I can get you a ticket too. So it's a great event, great opportunity to hear about the work that we're doing to protect and restore and steward land across BC. So October 2nd in Vancouver. naturetrust.bc.ca for details.
Thank you. One of the highlights for me as a director was the annual trip in June. Usually we would go to the Kootenays, we would go in other years to the Okanagan, in other years we would go to the coast, and we would see some of, at that time, 400 properties. I gather it's, what, 500?
Over 500
Over
now.
500 properties. And you see there the wildlife corridors, the estuary. I think one of the things, I forget who, but one of the biologists said, people want to live where the creatures want to live, and that's the valley bottoms and estuaries. So it's something 100%. Like, what is the biodiversity stat in terms of the land area of British Columbia?
Well, as you say, people and species want to live in a very select percentage of the province. Well over 90% of the province is not private land. We mainly work on the private land base, and not coincidentally, that private land base is in the highest biodiversity areas, as you mentioned, valley bottoms, estuaries, grasslands in the interior. So people and the biodiversity of BC are highly concentrated in the same landscapes. Right here, we're in the coastal Douglas Fir ecological zone, which is the most biodiverse, the most threatened, and the least protected of BC's ecological zones. So people want to live here, species want to live here. We have to find a way to have both.
One of the things it's important in this conversation is to bring it back to the municipal relationships, because that's really why we're here this week. And given the fact that you are where so many British Columbians reside, that's where their governments are at the local level. Can you tell me a little about how some of those relationships function between Nature Trust, municipalities, and other layers of government towards the goals that you have?
Great question, Stuart. So yesterday I drove down Vancouver Island and passed through Parksville, about 120 kilometers north of here. And the city of Parksville and the Nature Trust of BC have a longstanding partnership, and we actually just protected a property together on Quolluc, the Englishman River. And so we are helping the city to accomplish their goals to make the key watershed in their city more resilient, to protect the biodiversity that is coastal Douglas fir right there in Parksville, And it's part of our larger effort to build a conservation corridor along that river and restore the riparian corridor and the estuary to its former glory, providing amazing habitat for migratory birds, for steelhead, wild salmon, et cetera.
There's an idea that is fairly new to me. I was aware of the components of it, but it was only recently when ResourceWorks developed a report, and there are copies of this report on every table, Shaping the Peace, Balancing Energy, Environment, and Reconciliation in Northeast British Columbia's Peace River region. And the thing I'm referring to is what's regarded as, or termed, the restoration economy. And I, as I say, hadn't heard of this, but a couple of our researchers, Margareta was one, she was co-lead, and Rawi Elner from UBC Forestry, recent graduate, bringing the latest ideas from the academy into our work, introduced me to this. And I think it's something that everyone can recognize, because the restoration economy is about the emerging field of repairing disturbed landscapes. Well, emerging, we've been doing this for a long time, but the way we think about it is the emerging part, whether it's former mines, gas fields, other industrial footprints from years, decades, or even more than a century past, in ways that create both ecological and economic value. And this is a model not just about cleaning up environmental liabilities. It's about reconciliation, about empowering First Nations and equipping them with the resources to bring about changes on the landscape that fit with the particular local requirements. If you look at the Shaping Peace report on page 66, there's a couple of pages introducing this idea. Of course, this is germane to the Northeast. We've seen cumulative impacts and the restoration of that become an incredibly high priority for government and First Nations and, of course, industry. And we're watching now how this unfolds. It is, for those who are in that, well, it's not easy, but I think it's important to build some shared understanding as to what this is about. So, Jasper, I just wanted to get your expert description of what the restoration economy means or can mean in your work.
Well, Stuart, when you were on our board, our focus was on securement, which is land acquisition, and stewardship of those lands. But when we updated our strategic plan about 5 years ago, we added restoration. So our focus is now a three-legged stool of securement, restoration, and stewardship. And that reflects the growing opportunities and the growing program of habitat restoration that we've launched over the last 7 or 8 years. And estuaries that you mentioned are a great example of that. In Parksville, we're restoring the English and River Estuary. That's one of about 15 different estuaries on the BC coast where we're working with First Nations, with the federal government, the province, other NGOs to restore habitat function in estuaries, to make them more resilient to sea level rise, to make them more functional for fish and wildlife. And so it's a huge opportunity. BC has had over a century of industrial activity in some of these estuaries, and for industrial activities that are long finished, the legacy of impact continues. And so we've been working with our partners to better understand what needs to happen, whether it's removing old infrastructure that's no longer used, returning tidal flow. And there's just some really exciting projects that we have underway here on Vancouver Island, the Central Coast, and beyond. And I think it's a great opportunity. We're working with, you mentioned municipalities, but we're also working with contractors, some of the same heavy equipment contractors that some of your sponsors are using for their business. Shout out to Parksville Heavy Equipment. They're a great locally owned company in Parksville, and they have helped us to do some really exciting and innovative restoration work.
But it's not necessarily easy to do all of that. Are you encountering any issues in getting the expertise and the labor force to do that?
Well, BC's blessed with a really strong sector for consulting hydrologists and engineers, so we're in a pretty good standpoint there. Sometimes we have challenges finding enough qualified bidders for our restoration projects, and that can actually halt progress on projects. We're doing a forest thinning project in the East Kootenay right now, and last year when we put it out to bid after 3 years of work to get the project ready to go, we only had one bidder, and that bidder put a throwaway bid in that was a multiple of what the a reasonable cost for that work would be. So we had to pause the whole project, and this year we're going out to bid again to try again. And so that project's going to have real impact on bighorn sheep and badgers and other iconic BC wildlife, but we can't get it done until we find enough, find a contractor that will do the work that can help us achieve the project goals at a reasonable cost.
I'd just like to turn to the audience, and in a few minutes, if anyone's got a question, think about that question, because I'd love to open the mic up for that. And if Simon could be ready for that. There's a problem in finding the necessary people to do that work. Do you see any solution in sight to that?
Well, for us, we're just going to try again this year, and we're going out to our partners to try and raise more funds to get a budget that we think might be able to get the project done. But like all the companies in the room, we are affected by inflation, by the escalating costs of getting it done in BC. And when you're doing restoration that might have a timeline of 5, 6, or 7 years, it can be challenging. So in that case, we're reaching out to forestry contractors, and there might not be a lot in a small town outside Cranbrook that are willing and able and ready to do the work. So having a healthy ecosystem of contractors is part of getting the job done.
Simon is in the far corner there, so anyone who wanted to jump into this, please feel free, and he'll come over with the microphone. I just want to delve further into this. I mean, it's intriguing because in one corner of the province, I understand there is a lot of funding available for restoration projects, and the utilization of those funds seems not to be progressing, I'm sure, for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't fully understand. And there is a public desire, and here's where I think there's this public conversation to be had. The framing of restoration as an economic and environmental win that can also build legitimacy and real trust based on real progress for the resource industries, which are always under intense scrutiny. And I would say that we shouldn't expect that scrutiny to grow less over time. So unlocking allocated resources, whether those come from federal or provincial or municipal or other sources, if it's all there and you're at the ground level finding it difficult to get those resources, I'd just like to throw that out there to anyone who has a view on that to help me solve it, because I'm aware that in the southeast of British Columbia, where there's a lot of mining, historic mining, as well as the northeast, where you've got the oil and gas and forestry industries, which are under pressure on cumulative impacts. You've got a lot of potential, but how do we unlock that potential? That's my question. So Simon is going to please identify yourself. And
I'm Dina Beeston, Town of Ladysmith Mayor. I know in some provinces they have funds that are pulled from the industries that cause the need for restoration, and they're put aside for restoration. Does BC have such a thing, and are those funds actually put in a separate account and held for restoration?
I can't think of an industrial example, but there is actually a successful model from property tax assessments in some regional governments of BC. So the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen, is anyone here from RDOS? They have a great program called the South Okanagan Conservation Fund. And so the the people in that community decided they wanted to invest in protection and restoration of habitat in their community, and they set up a parcel tax to set up that special fund.
So to me, that's just more downloading, because you've got maybe the resource extraction happening and then the money's gone. And then people down here at the municipal level go, okay, well, let's fix it. And so then you go after the property taxes of people that are then, you know, we're trying to run our municipality to take something else on that probably should be coming from provincial.
Got another example for you. Just thought of, so BC Hydro, I used to work there. They have a program called the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. And so every year, BC Hydro sets aside some funding for fish and wildlife projects in the watersheds where they have generating facilities. And so I think that program is about $10 million a year, and it's here on the coast, in the Columbia Basin, and in the Peace, where the major BC Hydro dams are. So that's one example. South of the border, there's a similar program with through the Bonneville Power Administration. The difference is that they are putting orders of magnitude more funding into fish and wildlife there. So, the government down there has chosen to invest about $1 billion so far in fish and wildlife projects through that entity.
Hi, I'm Jeff Morrison with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. I do want to respond to that. In the oil and gas industry, it is completely covered by industry. You cannot drill a well, create a pipeline without first having a reclamation plan and having a bond to cover that. And in addition to that, there is a 100% fund for orphan wells that is covered by industry. The taxpayer in BC is not on the hook for any oil and gas activity cleanup in BC. That is regulated by the BCER, and that's a great thing. We're very proud of that.
Hi, Mia Parker from Moe Canada West. So any project that requires a tenure, a lease, or a license of occupation in BC has a requirement for the leaseholder to return that land to as it was before it was used, whether that's subsurface or land. So if you require a lease or a tenure in the province, you have to return it back to its function. Where the gap actually exists is what happens on private land, and also where provincial operations impact. So to the point about fish and BC Hydro's activities, so they have a separate fund as a Crown corporation, but for example, Ministry of Transportation and Highways doesn't. And there's no requirement for people who own land to restore it if they impact it. So the gap is actually in provincial operations and in private landholder operations. But if you lease or tenure land, you have to return it back at your own cost. And there's a surety or bond for salmon aquaculture. There's a bond. There's a bond as well for oil and gas, and also for mining. So it's the piece between the big and the small that's gapped.
Interesting comments, and it almost sounds like there's a gap between the public narrative and what's really happening with the legislative responsibilities, regulated responsibilities of industry and what it does, which really just brings me back to where this started of building understanding of what that is. So it's a positive, because if it is perpetually something where industry feels like it's on the defensive, then that's not really progressing towards having the shared understanding that would be so beneficial. Do you have this as a topic? I mean, as you mentioned, it's after my time that restoration came onto the mandate for the Nature Trust, but is this something that you're talking about, Jasper, at the board level?
Well, we just had a question about a reference to transportation, so that brings up an interesting example. So here on Vancouver Island, the main highway was built 50 plus years ago by a contractor called the Emil Anderson Group. And for that project, they bought some land and established a gravel pit near the Englishen River. And once the project was complete and the highway was built, they just held on to that piece of land for many years, and there was a portion of it that was disturbed for the gravel pit, and then the rest was intact forest along the Englishman River. And so to this day, they are one of the major road builders and road maintainers in our province. And they reached out to us about a decade ago and said that they wanted to see this land protected. And so it was a very complex transaction, but they worked with us, and in the end, they were able to donate over 60 acres of riverfront land on the Englishman River, free and clear, to conservation. It's now called the Emil Anderson Legacy Forest. Invite all of you to go visit it. It's just near Top Ridge at Parksville. And it's an amazing natural legacy from a company that literally has helped to build BC.
Now, I don't want to put you on the spot with something we haven't talked about, but there is something I've been hearing about the last just few days. I wasn't paying close attention to the heritage conservation legislation, and I know there's a bit of a buzz right now. There's some changes. Is this an issue you're following? And if not, maybe there's someone in the audience who could shine a bit of light on it.
We mentioned that people and wildlife live in the same landscapes, and estuaries are a good example of that. Estuaries are disproportionately important for supporting species in BC. They also have been occupied by people since time immemorial. And so when we're doing restoration projects in estuary, it's really important to have partnerships with local First Nations and work closely with them to make sure that while we're restoring the habitat, we're not disturbing the archaeological resources in that same landscape. So again, in Parksville, when we are removing fill from an old project to restore the habitat, we uncovered a old fish weir that's not all as First Nations ancestors had been using. So we worked closely with them to try to remove the fill that was preventing the fish populations from thriving, but not disturbing that cultural asset. I'd say more and more archaeological resources are a key factor in having to work towards achieving restoration, and it's not something as a biologist I ever anticipated being a part of restoration, but going forward, it's a key factor.
Interesting. I'd just like to pause and let everyone know something quite exciting that's happening through the day. And I'm going to look to the far corner where Matt Embry, he's a documentary filmmaker, is helping us to tell the Get It Done story. His film crew's in the room, but also Matt is conducting one-on-one interviews with people who are on the stage. But there's probably people in the room who maybe aren't part of today's program who would be great interviews. So you'll see Matt around if you're interested in learning about his work. It'll help ResourceWorks to tell the story, get it beyond these four walls, because don't we all go to so many conferences where you have a great time and it's just the people in the room, unfortunately, who get the benefit of it. We're trying to break that mold, as we do with everything we do, and Matt is a huge part of that. So I welcome anyone to go and chat with him about what we're doing. I just wanted to come into the delicate, perhaps, topic of professional reliance. There's been a lot of change in that, and in conversations I'm having with companies, with industry, with professionals in a range of domains that are essential for the conduct of industry, it seems as if the changes of recent years have basically slowed things down, where the ability to make decisions and then carry them out is not what it should be in order to have these goals for landscape restoration or really anything else in natural resources. Any comments on this area?
Well, I'm not sure about professional reliance, but one of the things that we're seeing is some of the regulations in BC haven't necessarily kept up with the higher level strategic goals of the province. So, the province is committed to Indigenous reconciliation, and which is a must for the province going forward, and yet there's some challenges in advancing Indigenous-led restoration projects in BC on agricultural land because the definitions of agriculture don't take into account the agricultural practices of the Indigenous people of BC that predated, the more recent agricultural activities. And so we've bumped into some challenges with that, with the Agricultural Land Commission, not seeing restoration of Indigenous food systems as being an agricultural activity and impeding the restoration of the Cowichan Estuary, which is one of the most important on Vancouver Island for fish and wildlife and people too.
All right. If no one has any question or comment, I'd like to ramp things down here and move to our next panel, but I just wanted to put a cap on this. I think there's growing evidence from published work and different public conversations that the restoration economy could become BC's next major employment sector, particularly in regions where there has been a large amount of activity and there's a large amount of future potential. And if we can get all this right, then that potential can be realized. But in order to have the public conversations needed and address reconciliation, rebuild ecosystems, we're then able to shore up social license for the development ahead, which we know is essential to functioning economy. And so with that thought, I would like to thank you, Jasper, for coming here today. I hope this session has helped to set the stage for what follows, because we're going to be covering so much ground, so many areas. It's going to be engaging. We're going to be hearing from you in the floor. As UBCM has its first day, there's people coming and going. If you need to leave, just use your judgment. Don't worry about waiting until the session's over. If you've got to get somewhere to a meeting, or if you're coming back in, just make your way to where you are, and everything will be smooth. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Jasper Lament for today's presentation.
Thanks, Stuart.